afternoon, and thank you for coming to this. As the video said at the end, this is 10 years of MITE. It's 10 years since we had our first meeting with our inaugural members. And we're very excited to be able to share with you this premiere showing of the video that highlights some of the people and some of the work that's been going on at MIT over these past 10 years. One of our big assets at MITE has been an extraordinary external advisory board. We have quite a few extraordinarily capable people with amazing reach in the energy and political world. Each year around the External Advisory Board Committee meeting, we ask that one of these board members share with us some of their expertise and their insights into the energy field. Really delighted this year to have Norm Augustine to talk with us about some of his perspectives on energy. Norm is a graduate of Princeton University in aerospace aeronautical engineering. He has served in many different capacities, first as Undersecretary of the Army, later as Acting Secretary of the Army. He was Chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin Corporation. I think he was later a lecturer at Princeton with rank of full professor. He was the Chairman and Principal Officer of the American Red Cross, Chairman of the National Academy of Engineering, Chairman of the Aerospace Industries Association, and on. I could spend all your time giving your accomplishments here. But we're delighted to have him with us this afternoon to share some of his thoughts on the future of energy. And I think the subtitle here is Certain Uncertainties. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Norm for his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. That was a very generous introduction for an unemployed aerospace worker such as myself. But this being a meeting about energy, when I hear all those kind words, I can't help but be reminded of an introduction that a friend of mine, David Roderick, who was at the time chairman of U.S. Steel, he had received. And of course, they use an awful lot of energy in his business. Dave was introduced by a master of ceremonies who said that David was one of America's most gifted business persons. And to prove it, this master of ceremonies cited just one little fact. He said David had made $10 million in California oil. And David came up to the podium, and he was obviously somewhat uncomfortable. He said the introduction had been essentially accurate, but he said truly it was not California, it was Pennsylvania, and actually it wasn't oil, it was coal. And actually it wasn't 10 million, it was 10,000. And it wasn't he, it was his brother. And he didn't make it, he lost it. So with that, thank you very much for such a nice introduction. It's indeed true that I've had the privilege of serving on the MIT Energy Initiative Advisory Board for a number of years, and it's with great pride that I've had the privilege of doing that. And it's also been a great opportunity and a period of excitement to see some of the brilliant work that's going on and some of the most imaginative work in the field of energy of which I'm aware. And to have the opportunity to be around people who are trying to solve one of the most important and broadly applicable challenges that the world faces today is indeed a rare privilege. And I'm very much looking forward to what the initiative will accomplish in the next 10 years, which we're now underway. I should begin, of course, by confessing that I'm not an expert in energy matters. I'm an aerospace engineer who in my career moved into systems engineering, and the provision of energy, of course, is a huge systems challenge, so that I felt that maybe I could contribute a little bit there. And then later in my career, as my engineer friends say, that I descended into management, but we won't talk about that. But before you dismiss everything I have to say, let me just remind you, I am a rocket scientist, so whatever that's worth. Today, our nation has some very difficult and important decisions to make with regard to the energy and climate future, not only of our country, but of the world writ large. As we all know, in the past decades, the United States became extremely dependent upon Mideastern oil to the extent we were shipping some $6 billion a week to pay our energy bill overseas. Several years ago at a press conference that was held by an independent organization that I belong to of former government employees who were committed to trying to, from the outside, build support for energy research and development. At that press conference, one of the people representing the media had asked if the problem was that the United States didn't have an energy policy. Now, this was some years ago, and one of our members, who was a very well-known former U.S. Senator, he responded by saying, oh, but we do have an energy policy. Our policy is to support a foreign cartel by importing billions of dollars of oil and sending them billions of dollars in return, some of which they can use to fund terrorists who are trying to kill us. That's our policy. Well, that is a bit of a harsh assessment, but it did have elements that rang somewhat true. Now, lots happened over the years due to the efforts of an awful lot of people, some in the Department of Energy and some in this room who I know that were there. Many of the more difficult decisions that have to be made in any field are decisions that involve major capital investments in items that are long-lived and where the environment in which they will function is shrouded in uncertainty. And that's a perfect description of many of the decisions that will have to be made in the application of new energy techniques. It's a great opportunity for people who like taking risks. And I'm, of course, not speaking of ill-considered risks. I'm talking about judgmental, considered risks where the benefits justify the risks that are being taken. The underpinning of a clean energy world in the future, in my opinion, is research. That's the underpinning, necessary but not sufficient. But the federal government's investment in energy research has been declining largely. And so the question comes up, if not the federal government, who is going to make up the difference? Might it be industry? Clearly industry is one of the beneficiaries of research in energy. And indeed, in the area of development, industry has been picking up much of the slack in R&D writ large. In this regard, let me briefly share with you a lesson I learned from an incident that occurred several years ago. When the firm where I was working had a number of, I thought, really promising opportunities in the research arena. I would call it applied research, probably. And we were so excited about it, we decided to increase our investment in research substantially, still small compared with the overall expenditures of the corporation. And we called a briefing on Wall Street, sent the company's president there to tell the people on Wall Street, the analysts, what a great, exciting opportunity this was to impact future profitability and growth. Well, at the end of the briefing by the company's president, this actually happened on Wall Street, most of the audience got up and literally ran out of the room and sold our stock. Our stock dropped 11% in 4 days. Just to calibrate that, there were about 182,000 of us in the company that worked that entire year to get the stock up by almost 11%. Shortly after, what became known in the research labs and in the corporate offices as the debacle on Wall Street, I asked one of the analysts, who I happened to know, who had been present at the briefing, I wasn't there, what we had said that was wrong. And I can almost verbatim tell you what he said. He responded, I'm told rather impatiently, that we should know that it takes 10 or 15 years for research to pay off, if it ever does at all. and your average shareholder owns your stock for 18 months. And they don't care what happens to you in 10 or 15 years, and for sure they don't want to pay for it. And by that time, your investors today will probably own your competitors' shares anyway. And so the analyst then administered the coup de grace, and I think this is pretty much verbatim. He said that our firm does not invest in corporations with such short-sighted management. That was his word. Figure that out. That's a true story. Anyway, today about 80% of America's chief financial officers, CFOs, say that they would cut R&D if it were necessary to meet the next quarter's profit forecast. The root of the problem, I think, is that at the time I first entered the industrial world long, long ago, the average stockholder held their shares for 8 years. Today, it's 4 months and declining. And in fact, day traders improved, quote, improved that to milliseconds that they hold their shares. And so you have a market that demands returns next quarter, and that's not compatible with performing research, and it's not compatible with conducting technology demonstrations at scale. But once research has been successfully conducted, there are still further hurdles that remain to be surmounted that the policy world has not yet fully dealt with. The first of these hurdles, of course, that is widely known as the Valley of Death, not unique to energy. Bedevils all innovators as they try to progress from laboratory results in research to proven technologies at the bench or a little larger level. Unlike most fields, though, energy R&D faces a second, even major valley of death that requires going from that technology prototype to full-scale demonstration to show the feasibility and economic viability of the concept. And that's an extraordinarily costly and extraordinarily time-consuming undertaking. We do have some reasonably good mechanisms to help get through that first valley of death. We have very few to help get through that second valley. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that as I go on. The second valley, of course, for starters, is who is going to put up the necessary capital and the innovative drive it takes to get an idea from the prototype phase to a full-scale demonstration of economic feasibility. The answer, it would seem to me, is going to have to reside in combining the strengths of our government with the power of the free enterprise system with the underpinning of world-class academic research. Consider the impact of just one major development that is certainly coming down the highway, no pun intended, but that would be electric cars. I think not much further behind may be self-driving vehicles, and especially passenger vehicles, not trucks. Trucks, I think, more likely will depend on fuel cells. But the Chevy Bolt that is now getting about 240 miles per refueling or range is really making all electric propulsion much more practicable, but there's still some problems that remain that we'll come to. I think most of us probably in this room would view all electric light vehicle fleet with a considerable optimism. I sure do. No more carbon emitting internal combustion engines, just clean electricity pouring out of the wall plug into the vehicle. Before coming back to that, let me just mention that it reminds me, some years ago I was in a used bookstore, and prowling through it I found a book on mechanical engineering that had been printed in, just right after 1900. And the opening line in the entire book said, "The horse is dead." And if you were to see the 2000 version of that same book, my guess is that it would say the internal combustion engine is dead, except, or at least as it applies to passenger vehicles. That's going to take a bit of time, but it's not a bad bet probably. Well, for openers, what's wrong with this picture? One thing is that today about 2/3 of the nation's electricity is currently generated from fossil fuels, a share that's relatively slow to change. Nuclear reactors, of course, provide about 20% of the electric power. I note that 6 of them are scheduled to be retired within the next decade, and those 6 together provide more power than all the nation's solar panels combined. And I say that not to diminish the importance of solar power, but it's to question whether nuclear should be a 4-letter word in the minds of many of our policy makers, including those in Europe, parts of Europe. Unfortunately, too many of the nation's decision makers are overlooking the fact that there's no magic box behind that wall plug pouring electricity into our cars, that electricity is being created and is likely to be created for a long time with far from clean energy. That brings us to the Earth's fragile environment. As everyone in this room knows, we've now passed about 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. The Earth's average temperature has increased around 1 degree Celsius in the last century or so. That's a rise with very serious implications, and especially so if that rate were to be sustained. And I personally happen to believe the scientific evidence relating to global warming. And yes, I do understand the hazards of small samples, and also that there's a difference between causality and correlation. But to me, the data is relatively convincing. And if nothing else, I think the idea of carrying on a giant uncontrolled experiment that potentially profoundly and irreversibly could impact our planet would seem to be an experiment that deserves a great abundancy of conservatism. Fortunately, the United States has been given a partial reprieve, if you might call it that, to implement longer-term solutions to the energy dilemma that we face. That reprieve is called hydraulic fracking. And as controversial as it might be, indeed, it has problems of its own. But whatever the case, about a decade ago, America's energy firms were scrambling to construct natural gas import facilities to bring gas from abroad into the country. And now the U.S. is passing the Saudi Arabia and Russia combined in the export of oil and gas. And the U.S. should become a net exporter of gas very likely next year. And this significantly changes the equation of the economy in many respects. It certainly changes the world's geopolitical balance in many respects. And the day is approaching when Mideastern oil, instead of going west from the Hormuz Straits, may go east from the Hormuz Straits. And that raises all kinds of interesting geopolitical questions. Who is to defend the Hormuz Straits, for example? The revolution in energy was really a result, this revolution I refer to, of fracking, was a result of probably 3 rather fundamental technological breakthroughs that were supported by both government and industry that consorted to unlock this energy source. And the first of these was, of course, advanced 3D seismics. The second was the development of horizontal drilling at extended ranges. And the third was hydraulic fracking itself. And secondary recovery of oil is not a new notion in this country. It's been underway for well over a century, but only in much shallower and much smaller wells at far lower pressures. And while access to unconventional gas is an enormous boon to the economy and national security, it's not without its own challenges and detractions. Shale gas itself is, of course, a finite quantity, although abundant in short-term thinking of maybe a century. And while natural gas is clean compared to oil and coal, it's certainly not clean in an absolute sense. And natural gas greenhouse emissions in the form of carbon dioxide are about 30% lower per BTU than those of oil and about 44% less than of coal. But a critic might state that somewhat differently and would say that natural gas is 70% as polluting as oil and 56% as polluting as coal. Nonetheless, the development of shale gas does seem to provide an opportunity to devote attention to truly clean, sustainable energy sources. That's particularly true when one views the context that 82% of the United States primary energy source or production is still derived from fossil fuels, and that the general dependency is going to be with us for a very long time. And the equivalent figure for the world as a whole is about 88%, and that's a number that's only declined by about 1% in the last quarter of a century. Whatever one's perspective is, natural gas is an enormous improvement over the status quo, but that we're going to be depending on fossil fuels to a considerable degree for a very long time, making such things as sequestration very important. In the case of cleaner generation of electricity, where I think some of the biggest opportunities lie because of what I would expect to be a widespread adoption of electric vehicles, passenger vehicles, substantial progress has been made in this area. The fraction of electricity that's produced in the U.S. that's attributable to natural gas has nearly doubled in the last few years, about a decade or more. We now get about a third of the electricity that's generated from that source. Also, as all electric cars become capable of greater ranges and of more rapid recharging, the demand for them is likely to increase, and that's likely to further increase the demand for clean electricity and whatever is behind that wall plug that could produce it. And this would be an important, really a huge opportunity, since about 94% of the fuel that's consumed in U.S. vehicles, trains, and planes is currently derived from crude. Well, while clean energy sources such as solar and voltaic, solar thermal, wind, wave, biomass, geothermal are all extremely important alternatives to fossil fuels, none of them would seem, at least to me, at least at this point, to be approaching becoming a mainline source of power, but rather will be relegated to important complementary companion sources. And if old forms of renewable energy are included, such as wood and hydroelectric, new renewables, in spite of being generally well subsidized, still provide less than half the total contribution of renewables themselves. And as attractive as these latter sources are, they too aren't without their disadvantages, whether it's intermittency or cost or unique forms of pollution that they too are burdened with. The massive, costly, and long-lived energy infrastructure in this country, at least as it exists today, is constituted around just four primary sources: petroleum, natural gas, coal, and nuclear. And the infrastructure that so much has been invested in represents a huge impedance when one tries to produce change in the delivery of power, not in the concepts or ideas of research. Of the roughly 100 quads of energy that we consume in this country each year, petroleum provides about a third, natural gas about 30%, coal around 17%, nuclear is I think at 9% now, and all the other sources are less than 10%. Professor Vaclav Smil of the University of Manitoba made an interesting calculation. And he calculated that it took under 60 years for worldwide energy usage to, that's historically, prior to the first of his calculations, that historically was based on burning wood. It took 60 years for it to go from 5% coal to 40% coal. He went on to calculate it took 60 additional years to go from 5% oil to 40% oil. But with the passage of a similar 60 years, natural gas has barely gotten to much over a quarter of worldwide energy usage. And indeed, once again, change in energy space takes a lot of time. Among the limitations of a lot of the renewable energy sources, is, of course, intermittency, which coupled with a growing demand for mobility makes energy storage a particularly critical requirement. In this regard, advancements in batteries in terms of energy density, both weight and volume, and recharge time, cost, is badly needed. I might add safety is badly needed, whether we're talking about handheld devices or we're talking about vehicles or perhaps the grid. And given the importance of safe, reliable, compact, affordable, portable energy storage devices, the advancements that have been achieved in recent years, I guess I would uncharitably characterize as somewhat modest, at least as compared with the needs. There have clearly been some important achievements, development of lithium ion cells, lithium oxygen sounds very promising, but nobody, I think, would confuse the pace of advancement in energy storage, battery technology, batteries in particular, that would compare with the rate of advancements in semiconductor integrated circuits or optics or space technology or genomics or other fields like that. And furthermore, the lithium-ion batteries that we count on so much have now been around for a quarter of a century. What would seem to be needed are quantum, again, no pun intended, but what are needed is a quantum jump in energy storage capability, particularly for mobile sources. And unfortunately, advancements like that are not likely to be derived from doing what we've been doing all along and trying harder. It seems likely they're going to come from new concepts, new fields, for example, solid-state battery. And under circumstances such as these, there's certainly a premium on thinking out of the box. And that has been the primary goal of the MIT Energy Initiative. And let me share with you one of my favorite examples of what it takes to think out of the box and how difficult it could be. The example I want to give you is not from the energy area, it's from the medical area. And a while back, there were a group of engineers and cardiologists who were meeting at a well-known university, not in this case MIT, and they were meeting to talk about the possibility of constructing a truly effective artificial heart. And somewhat ironically, the two groups had never sat down to talk about this before. One of the cardiologists began the session, I'm told, I wasn't there, I'm told, by listing the requirements that would be necessary for an artificial heart to perform adequately in terms of safety and functionability and so on. And the cardiologist barely got his presentation underway until he was interrupted by an engineer who inquired, would it be all right if instead of having your heart in your rib cage, could it be in your thigh where it would be easier to maintain? Well, there was silence in the room. And it turned out that nobody in the room had ever thought about that possibility before, even though the cardiologists have spent their entire lives studying the human heart. Well, after a brief interlude, the cardiologist was said to have proceeded with his presentation and was soon interrupted once again. And this time it was an engineer asking if instead of having one heart, could you have a network of 3 or 4 or 5 hearts in your system? Might that be better? Well, you get the idea. It created a whole new form of discussion and a new relationship between these two groups that has prospered to this day. And in this regard, it shouldn't go unnoticed, particularly with the group here, the impact that engineering is having in fields as far, seemingly as far apart as the biomedical field. I was working with NIH quite a bit the last few years, and they had conducted a survey of practicing physicians. These are physicians out dealing with patients. And the question was, what technological developments in the last decade or so have had the greatest positive impact in your ability to care for your patients? And it turned out the top 5 on the list, 3 of them were pure engineering. If I remember right, it was CAT scans, stents, and artificial joints. And once again, when dealing with complex fields like this, and I know it's true of the initiative here, that To have technologists working alone without policymakers, without economists, and so on, is not likely to lead to implementable successes. Well, when it comes to the subject of novel energy sources, it's not as though we lack truly promising opportunities in a fundamental sense. In the Pentagon, where I used to work, they would have referred to it as a target-rich battlefield. We have learned to, for example, engineer microbes to produce energy, and the microbes, it's pointed out to me as a retired business person, never take vacations, they never ask for raises, and they don't form unions. So some of the microbes that have been engineered are viewed with some favor. But we're finding that there are recoverable forms of energy in almost every waste product that one can imagine, including some that one probably would just soon not imagine. And there are remarkable new materials that are being developed that have energy applications. I think, for example, of graphene sheets and the ability to cover huge areas with very minor weights of sheeting. But the only long-term answer that I can think of to solve the world's energy problem, the basic energy source, if you will, is nuclear fusion. And when I was in graduate school, they were working on the Matterhorn project at Princeton. And I can recall that was a time, incidentally, when gasoline for your car cost 19 cents a gallon, except when there were price wars, and then it was 11 cents a gallon. And most of us had cars that weren't worth the price of having a full tank of gas in it either. But I asked one of the scientists that was working on the Matterhorn project, I said, how long will it be till we have commercial nuclear fusion generated electric power on the grid? And his answer was 30 years. Well, not too long ago, I was at the Fermi Lab, and I asked a group of scientists there, how long will it be till we have fusion-powered electricity on the grid commercially? And without hesitating, they all said 30 years. And not long ago, I was amused to see a newspaper article that was quoting an executive at the NIF, the National Ignition Facility, that said in 30 years, we will have electricity on the grid produced by fusion energy, absolutely. That's a quote. My conclusion is the good news is that we haven't lost any ground in the last 30 years. And I just never personally realized that, like E and pi, 30 is a universal constant. Of course, not everybody agrees with this assessment. Some are more optimistic, some much less so. It's as much an issue of funding and political will, if you will, as it is of science and engineering, admitting that the latter is one of the tougher problems that we've ever challenged. But whatever the case, it does seem to me that fusion energy is likely to be ultimately of the utmost importance, and that today, as a nation, we're significantly underinvested in it. Now, I haven't thus far mentioned the challenges of electric power distribution, and I focused on electric power because I think that's where many of the opportunities are. But how do you deal with this problem of distributing power on a grid that is quite ancient by today's standards, and trying to upgrade is a little bit akin to trying to rebuild an airplane in flight, where behind every cloud there are hackers. That's something we need to think more about. Hackers, not only individuals, but nation states. Now, our electric grid is one of the most complex systems that's ever been constructed, but as I say, in many ways, it's fairly primitive. A few years ago, I was asked to chair a committee to investigate why the power in much of suburban Washington, including Washington, D.C., seemed to cease to function, at least as described by the citizenry, whenever a cloud went over Washington. And to my amazement, I learned that the way the local power company determined which circuits were out, how it troubleshot its network after a storm, was they sat by the phone and waited for people to call and say, my house is dark. And then they use that information to plot out where the current was flowing and where it wasn't, and through a little logic could deduce where they should send the maintenance crews. And I probably have to confess to you, when our group turned in its final report, 6 of the 10 of us on the group went out and bought home generators. But I'm happy to say that at least thus far, the one we bought has never been needed yet. The challenge of upgrading or reducing such a vast system is complicated by the difficulty, read impossibility, of testing a system of this, fully testing a system of this complexity. The dilemma is suggested by some work of Friedrich Weichhorst that I always found interesting from a German institution. And he derived the equation that describes the number of states that a system can exist in if each element or each node of the system can impact every other node, but only in the simplest possible way, namely on, the connection is on or it's off, 1 or 2. Weichhorst called his equation the monster, and I think he did so quite appropriately. With only 2 nodes, the number of states is obviously 4. But if you go up to just 6 nodes, the number, according to my slide rule, was 1,073,741,824 possible states. And with a system as widely distributed geographically as the electric grid, it's unlikely, or we know that every element can't directly affect every other element, which is required in Weichhorst theory. Nonetheless, it does seem clear that the number of possibilities is huge. And we do know that every node could, many nodes can affect other nodes that are very distant indirectly. And for example, when a tree brushing against a power line in Ohio shut down the electric power for 50 million people in northeastern United States and parts of neighboring Canada a few years ago. Well, that brings me to the final portion of my remarks, which concerns whether we're properly organized and resourced to meet such demanding challenges as confront us in the energy and environmental areas closely linked. First of all, given the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it would seem that we're greatly underinvesting in clean energy research and development as a whole. And I look with dismay at the funding or non-funding of ARPA-E. When ARPA-E was first proposed in the Gathering Storm report, it was anticipated by now, some 12 years later, that ARPA-E's budget would be $1 billion a year. Instead of that, its very survival has recently been challenged, and that's notwithstanding its considerable successes. ARPA-E has, in fact, accomplished a great deal in helping move through that first valley of death and has helped somewhat in the second valley of death, even with the modest budget it's had. The number one energy R&D funding priority in my mind is to increase ARPA-E's budget to the $1 billion level within the next 5 years. The number 2 is to invest in much more in basic research, at least twice what we're now spending. And the next would be to start building bridges across the second valley of death. So with regard to that second valley of death, I'd like to make a proposal today, which is a companion, a sister to ARPA-E, that would be patterned after another highly successful organization, In-Q-Tel, and perhaps some of you may have heard of it. About 20 years ago, the CIA asked that a mechanism be established whereby industry and academia might work together with the federal government to bring advanced technology to some of the most important problems facing the intelligence community, to do so in the open, but to put it very bluntly, do it without the stifling impact of government bureaucracy. The result was an organization called In-Q-Tel. And one of the lessons that we learned when we formed In-Q-Tel is the fundamental need is to be able to attract the most capable, imaginative, innovative people you possibly can, and to provide them an environment in which they can be free to innovate. But there was a second need, and of course that was also addressed by In-Q-Tel, and that was to encourage the investment and draw upon this huge innovative enterprise that exists today already to help solve problems in the intelligence world, which I think the same thing could be done to a considerable degree in the energy world if such an organization were adequately funded far more than ARPA-E is. One of the big problems that we discovered was that entrepreneurs don't want to deal with the federal government. They can't afford the delays and the bureaucracy, if you will. I'm not anti-government. I spent 10 years proudly with our government. But it is true that large organizations, particularly government organizations, that don't have competitors tend to become very set in their way. Well, the keys to resolving the roadblocks in In-Q-Tel's case included that they were given the ability to attract extraordinary people, but also to be free of government procurement rules and hiring rules, and were able to adopt their own investment practices. And that included the ability to award grants, to award contracts, even take equity positions, and to make the decisions to do so almost overnight. And when that happened, all of a sudden people began appearing at the door with great ideas, many of whom hadn't talked to each other before, and each had half of an answer to a problem. In-Q-Tel since has been, as I say, very successful. It's an outside firm. It's not a government firm. It's funded by the government. It works for the government. It's owned by the government. But it's run by a board of totally outside individuals. And it's a board that I think it would be fair to say would be welcomed by any Fortune 100 company in the country. The organization has to obviously abide by all laws, all regulations that govern broad public companies. It has to abide by the same ethical rules. But when they have failures, the first thing that does not happen is that a big investigation is started that goes on for years. Being in the public domain, it has so much greater latitude than it does like government agency. Well, anyway, that leads to the idea of what I've called an In-Q-Tel-E for energy, for the lack of any other name. But I would hope that serious consideration could be given to passing this second valley of death with a government organization outside the government, funded by the government, totally managed and governed by individuals from outside the government. For companies to do this alone is equivalent to you bet your company. Well, that's my idea of the day. I'm often asked whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist when I look at some of the challenges we face. I always answer that by saying that a pessimist is a person who wants to be an optimist but has a working knowledge of the facts. Together, I'm convinced, I've worked in government, industry, and academia, and I'm convinced the three can work together to solve some truly amazing challenges. Remember the Apollo program as one example. We just need to be given the chance, and especially the chance, to take considered risks over long periods of time, celebrate the successes, but don't spend too much of our time studying the entrails of the failures. With that, I think we could accomplish a great deal. Again, I congratulate the Energy Initiative here at MIT on 10 very successful years. I look forward not only to 10 more years, but to many more after that until this problem is solved. Thank you all very much.